Stand up right now. Plant your feet on the floor. Feel the weight moving through your ankles, your shins, your femur, pressing downward through the arches of your feet and into the ground beneath you. Now take one step, just one. What you felt as a mechanical act, weight shifting, muscle contracting, bone-bearing load, was simultaneously an electrical act. The moment force entered your bone, crystalline structures inside it bent, and bending produced voltage. You just generated electricity inside your skeleton. This is not metaphor. It is not a loose analogy designed to make biology sound more interesting than it is. It is a measurable, repeatable, physical phenomenon with a formal name: piezoelectricity. And your bones have been doing this every time you move since the first time you pulled yourself upright as a child. Most people think of bone as structural, hard, inert, calcified, the scaffolding that holds everything else up. A passive framework of mineralized tissue that houses marrow and attaches muscle but otherwise does nothing. What bone actually is at a material science level is one of the most sophisticated electroactive composites ever assembled by a living system. And the electricity it produces when loaded is not a side effect of its structure. It is the mechanism by which your skeleton decides to grow, to repair, to reinforce itself. And when those signals disappear, it is the mechanism by which your skeleton quietly begins to dissolve. The piezoelectric effect was first formally described by Jacques and Pierre Curie in 1880, working with quartz crystals in a Paris laboratory. Certain crystalline materials, when subjected to mechanical stress such as compression, tension, or bending, develop a net electrical polarization across their surfaces. The asymmetry of the crystal lattice, when physically distorted, drives charge toward one surface and away from another. Apply pressure to a piezoelectric crystal, and you get voltage. Remove pressure, and the voltage disappears. Reverse the deformation, and you reverse the polarity. The Curies were working with quartz, tourmaline, and Rochelle salt. What no one yet suspected was that a very similar mechanism was operating inside every vertebrate skeleton on Earth. Your bone contains hydroxyapatite, which is a calcium phosphate mineral that forms microscopic crystals arranged throughout the extracellular matrix in a hierarchical architecture. Hydroxyapatite crystals are oriented along the long axis of bone. They are small enough, on the order of a few nanometers in their smallest dimension, that their piezoelectric response to bending is rapid and sensitive. But there is a second piezoelectric component that may be even more important. Bone is approximately 30% collagen by dry weight. The collagen is organized in a triple helix, 3 peptide chains wound around each other in a right-handed spiral. This helical geometry creates a molecular dipole along the fiber axis. When the collagen fibril is deformed by mechanical load, the geometry of the helix changes, the dipole shifts, and an electrical potential develops along the length of the fiber. The two materials, the mineral crystals and the collagen matrix, are not simply coexisting. They are interlocked at the nanoscale, with the mineral crystals nucleating and growing in the spaces within and between collagen fibrils. When bone bends, both systems deform together and their piezoelectric responses add rather than cancel. The combined signal is larger and more coherent than either material would produce alone. Evolution did not assemble this composite accidentally. The mechanical properties of bone, its combination of stiffness, toughness, and resistance to fatigue, emerge from the same hierarchical architecture that generates the electrical signals. The structure that carries the load is the structure that reports the load. The voltages involved are small by engineering standards. Piezoelectric measurements in bone have recorded potentials on the order of a few millivolts per unit of applied stress. But your cells do not require large voltages to respond. They are already operating in an environment of ion gradients and membrane potentials measured in tens of millivolts. A piezoelectric signal of the right magnitude at the right frequency delivered to the right cellular receptor is sufficient to act as a regulatory instruction. There is a frequency dimension to this that matters. The piezoelectric signal generated by a single foot strike arrives as a brief transient pulse, a rapid rise and fall over approximately 100 milliseconds, with the loading frequency of walking close to 1 Hz. But the collagen mineral composite does not respond only to low-frequency bending. Muscle contractions generate high-frequency vibrations in the 10 to 60 Hz range, transmitted directly through the bone during movement. These higher frequency signals appear to activate a different subset of the osteocyte mechanosensing apparatus, specifically pathways involving integrins, the molecular anchors that connect osteocytes to the surrounding matrix through their canalicular processes. When these integrins are stretched by fluid flow at high frequency, they trigger intracellular signaling through focal adhesion kinase, a protein that phosphorylates downstream targets including the RUNX2 transcription factor, which is the master regulator of osteoblast differentiation. Walking does not generate one electrical signal. It generates a spectrum of mechanical and electrical stimuli across a range of frequencies, and the bone integrates information from all of them simultaneously. Here is the mechanism in full. When you walk, your bones experience bending loads that are not uniform. The cortex of your femur, for example, is under compression on the posterior surface and under tension on the anterior surface as body weight moves over the limb. This asymmetric loading produces a gradient of electrical potential across the bone cross-section, with a negative potential on the compressed surface and a positive potential on the tension surface. This gradient persists for the duration of the loading cycle, roughly the duration of a single foot strike, approximately 100 milliseconds. Bone cells, specifically osteoblasts, the cells responsible for synthesizing new bone matrix, carry voltage-sensitive ion channels in their plasma membranes. These channels include members of the piezo family of mechanically activated channels, as well as voltage-gated calcium channels that open in response to local field changes. When the electrical potential in the matrix around an osteoblast becomes sufficiently negative, calcium ions flow into the cell, triggering a cascade that upregulates the expression of bone morphogenetic proteins, alkaline phosphatase, and type 1 collagen synthesis. More bone gets deposited where compression signals are most intense. Julius Wolff documented this pattern at the anatomical level in 1892 in a work published in Berlin called Das Gesetz der Transformation der Knochen, which translates as the law of bone transformation. Wolff observed that the internal architecture of cancellous bone, the open lattice of trabeculae visible in cross-section, was not random. The trabeculae aligned themselves in precise trajectories that matched the principal stress directions calculated by engineers, analyzing the same bone as a mechanical structure. Heavy trabeculae ran along the paths of maximum compression. Lighter trabeculae crossed them at angles corresponding to tensile stresses. The bone had apparently read the loading history of a lifetime and built its architecture accordingly. What Wolff could not explain was the mechanism by which a mechanical stimulus became a biological instruction. What the cells actually detected, what chemical or physical signal translated force into formation, remained opaque for another 70 years. But there is a second mechanism operating simultaneously through the same loading event. It is independent of piezoelectricity, and it amplifies the total electrical signal. The hollow spaces inside bone, the lacunae where mature bone cells called osteocytes reside, the canaliculi connecting those cells to each other, and to vascular channels, the Haversian canals themselves, are all filled with interstitial fluid. When bone is compressed, this fluid is driven through the narrow canalicular channels under pressure. The canaliculi are approximately 260 nanometers in diameter. As charged fluid molecules move through these channels, charge separation occurs at the fluid-solid interface. Positive ions in the fluid are attracted to the negatively charged channel walls, creating an electric double layer. When fluid flows, that layer of charge flows with it, generating what physicists call a streaming potential. These streaming potentials are electrolytic, arising from ion movement through fluid rather than from crystal deformation, and they act on the same cellular populations through overlapping but distinct pathways. The osteocyte at the center of this sensing network detects both the matrix strain and the fluid flow simultaneously through its cytoplasmic processes, which extend like a root system through the canalicular channels. Osteocytes release prostaglandin E2, nitric oxide, and insulin-like growth factor 1 in response to this combined signal, and these molecules coordinate the downstream activity of osteoblasts and osteoclasts across the tissue. A single osteocyte can communicate with hundreds of others through gap junctions at the ends of its processes. The canalicular network is a wired nervous system for bone, and the electrical and chemical signals it carries encode the history of every loading event. Harold Frost spent the second half of the 20th century at Southern Colorado Clinic developing a quantitative model of this system. He called it the mechanostat. The mechanostat proposes that each region of bone has a target range of strain, deformation measured in microstrain, where 1 microstrain equals 1/1,000,000th of the bone's original length, and that bone remodeling is regulated to maintain strain within that range. Below a minimum effective strain in the range of 50 to 200 microstrain, resorption dominates. Between roughly 1,000 and 3,000 microstrain, the bone is in maintenance equilibrium. Above a modeling threshold, new bone formation is upregulated to reduce future strain. Above a damage threshold, fatigue microcracks accumulate faster than repair can handle them. Walking generates cortical strains in the femoral diaphysis of approximately 1,000 to 2,000 microstrain, precisely in the maintenance range. The mechanostat is not metaphor. It is a regulatory system with measurable parameters and testable predictions. What happens when the input to that regulatory system vanishes entirely? NASA has had to answer this question since the first extended space flights of the late 1960s. Astronauts in microgravity lose bone mineral density at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month in the load-bearing regions, including the femoral neck, the lumbar vertebrae, and the calcaneus. 6 months aboard the International Space Station can produce bone loss equivalent to a decade of age-related decline on Earth. The bone does not simply thin uniformly. The trabecular architecture built over decades of gravitational loading begins to remodel toward a lower load configuration. Trabeculae thin and disconnect. The structural redundancy that makes bone resistant to fracture disappears. And when astronauts return to Earth's gravity, they cannot simply resume the loading that was interrupted. Bone that has lost its trabecular connectivity cannot recover it through normal walking because the scaffolding for rebuilding is gone. This is the clinical reality of removing the piezoelectric signal from bone for 6 months. It is also, in a less dramatic form, what happens to people who spend most of their waking hours seated. Robert O. Becker understood the electrical dimension of this problem before his colleagues were prepared to listen. Becker was an orthopedic surgeon at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Syracuse in the 1960s when he began mapping the surface electrical potentials of living bone in animals. He found a consistent pattern. Regions of active osteoblastic activity showed stable negative potentials. Regions of completed remodeling showed positive potentials. Fresh fracture sites showed a pronounced negative potential that declined in magnitude as healing progressed. Becker then asked whether applying external electrical current to a non-healing fracture could restart the healing process. His animal experiments showed that a small applied negative current at the fracture site provoked osteoblastic proliferation and new bone matrix deposition in bones that had been stalled for months. Becker's hypothesis was that the normal fracture healing response was itself electrically driven, that the negative potential appearing spontaneously at fracture sites was a biological signal activating the repair mechanism, and that in some patients this signal failed to develop or was insufficient to sustain the process long enough for healing to complete. Carl Brighton at the University of Pennsylvania developed parallel experimental evidence through the 1970s. Together, their work led to the clinical application of bone growth stimulators, implantable or external devices that deliver a controlled low-level electrical current to non-healing fractures. The FDA cleared the first such device in 1979. The devices work not by introducing any molecule or any cell, but by mimicking at a controlled amplitude the electrical signal that a normally loaded bone would generate through its piezoelectric and streaming potential mechanisms. Clinton Rubin at the State University of New York at Stony Brook took the question in an unexpected direction. Rubin demonstrated that extremely low-magnitude mechanical vibration with peak strains of less than 10 microstrain, far below the sensory threshold for perception, delivered at frequencies between 20 and 90 Hz, could maintain bone mass in animal models prevented from loading naturally. The vibration mimics the muscular tremor and vascular pulsation that bone experiences even during quiet standing. The electrical signals these tiny vibrations generate are far smaller than those produced by walking, yet they appear sufficient to maintain the baseline activity of the osteocyte network. Rubin's clinical trials in postmenopausal women showed that 10 minutes daily of low-magnitude vibration at 30 Hz, delivered through a platform that vibrated imperceptibly, was associated with measurable attenuation of bone loss over a year compared to control. The implication is not that vibration replaces walking, it is that the skeleton has a listening threshold far below what we assumed. The bone is not waiting for the massive loads of exercise to pay attention. It is monitoring every small oscillatory input that movement generates, and it is using those inputs to calibrate its maintenance state continuously. Now consider what happens in the 8, 10, or 12 hours a day many people spend seated. Sitting reduces mechanical loading of the lower limb skeleton to levels at or below Frost's minimum effective strain. The piezoelectric signals from walking stop arriving. Streaming potentials through the canaliculi quiet. The osteocyte network, receiving diminished input, shifts its cytokine output toward a configuration that favors resorption. Not dramatically, not in a way that produces symptoms, but the bias in a system that was built by decades of walking is now operating in a deficit of the signal that built it. The data from sedentary populations confirms what Frost's mechanostat predicts. Older adults who transition from moderate activity to primarily sedentary behavior show measurable decreases in femoral neck bone mineral density within months, not years. A 2013 study by Chastain and colleagues published in the journal Osteoporosis International found that each additional hour of sitting per day was independently associated with a 4% lower total hip bone mineral density in older women, even after accounting for exercise levels. Exercise performed for 30 minutes did not fully compensate for the prolonged signal deficit that followed it. The bone is counting inputs across the full day, not averaging the peaks. There is also a reciprocal relationship between the electrical biology of bone and the electrical biology of muscle. Skeletal muscle contractions generate their own bioelectric signals, action potentials, and force-dependent calcium transients. And these propagate through the connective tissue and periosteum into the outer surface of bone. The periosteum is richly innervated and highly responsive to mechanical stimulation. Osteoblasts in the periosteum are among the first to respond to new loading. When muscle is lost, as happens rapidly during immobilization, illness, or severe sedentarism, the loss of muscle-derived mechanical and electrical input to bone precedes and accelerates the loss of bone itself. Muscle and bone are not parallel structures declining independently. They are co-regulated systems, and the electrical signal that links them is generated by movement. Osteoporosis is described in clinical medicine as a calcium problem, a vitamin D problem, a hormonal problem, an estrogen deficiency that allows osteoclasts to outpace osteoblasts after menopause. All of these framings are accurate as far as they go. What the piezoelectric model adds is that osteoporosis is also a physics problem. The skeleton has the cellular machinery to maintain itself. It has access to mineral. What it lacks, in people who rarely walk and in elderly people whose walking frequency and stride length have declined, is the electrical instruction that walking reliably generates. The bones of a person who walks 30 minutes a day have received, for that 30 minutes, approximately 3,000 loading cycles per leg, 3,000 piezoelectric pulses, 3,000 rounds of fluid flowing through canaliculi, 3,000 moments of instruction delivered to the osteocyte network. The molecular pharmacology of bone drugs has become remarkably sophisticated. Bisphosphonates accumulate in bone mineral and inhibit the enzyme pathways that osteoclasts use to resorb matrix, reducing the rate of bone loss. Teriparatide, a synthetic fragment of parathyroid hormone, activates osteoblast proliferation directly through receptor signaling. These drugs are effective and important. They do not, however, restore the architectural signal that distinguishes living, mechanically coherent bone from preserved but architecturally degraded bone. They alter the chemistry of the system without providing the physical instruction that the system evolved to receive. The evolutionary context matters here. Bone as a mineralized tissue first appeared in the fossil record approximately 500 million years ago in early jawless vertebrates. The earliest bony structures were not internal skeletons, but external dermal armor, plates of mineralized tissue covering the head and body of fish-like organisms living in the shallow seas of the Ordovician period. These early bony tissues already had osteocytes embedded within the mineral matrix, and those osteocytes were already producing signaling molecules in response to mechanical compression from water pressure and muscular movement. The electrical biology of bone is not a late addition to the skeleton's toolkit. It is the original toolkit. Every vertebrate that has lived on this planet since the Ordovician has carried a skeleton that generates voltage under mechanical load. 500 million years of selection pressure in animals that moved have calibrated the mechanostat with extraordinary precision. The frequency range it responds to, the strain magnitudes that trigger each phase of remodeling, the molecular pathways that transduce electrical signals into cellular behavior, all of this was refined across geological time by organisms that walked, swam, climbed, and ran. You walked in today, you climbed stairs or stood at a counter or moved across a room. Each of those events was, without your knowledge, an electrical experiment conducted inside your skeleton. Crystalline structures in the collagen mineral composite of your femur bent under load and generated voltage. Fluid moved through channels 200 nanometers wide and produced streaming potentials. Osteocytes in their lacunae detected the field and the flow. And they sent molecular messages to their neighbors, and those messages updated the continuous calculation of how much bone is needed here and here and here. Wolff saw the architecture and recognized it as an adaptive response to load. Frost quantified the strain thresholds that define the mechanostat's operating range. Becker identified the electrical signal as the carrier of the adaptive instruction. Rubin demonstrated how small that signal can be and still matter. And what all of them understood, each from a different angle, is that bone is not a mineral structure that happens to have cells living in it. It is a living electrical organ that happens to be mineralized. One step generates a piezoelectric pulse that lasts less than a second. 30 minutes of walking generates over 3,000 of them. Every one of those pulses is a message that arrives at the cells maintaining your skeleton and tells them, you are still being used. Keep building. When the messages stop arriving long enough, the skeleton draws the only conclusion available to it from the evidence it has.